So hopefully everyone is having a great start to your day. Thank you for joining us at our all BGEA work group convening. And those of you that have been with us know that after the summit, we like to convene a meeting in December to kind of go over some of the things that were presented and discussed at the summit, and then plan for the upcoming year. So today you will hear from several different members of our BGA collaborative about reports and data and things that have been highlighted and for us to use as a way to form what our next steps will be in coming up with solutions to address some of these issues. I would like to also introduce to some, but many of you, if you've met her one time or seen her one time, you know who she is, Ms. Tashara Halliard. She is our BGA Gwen's Girls research coordinator and has often helped to facilitate these meetings. And she and I will keep things moving as you have the agenda. And as you can see, it's very packed. I apologize somewhat. I mean, it's all important information. And if we were together, this is the opportunity that we often take to just, first of all, fellowship with one another and get to know what's going on with each member and organizations that you represent. But then we also take more time to break out into groups. And so we're going to do that still in this platform, but wanted to first just start off by saying welcome. In true Gwen's Girls fashion, as you all know, we are sanctuary certified, and part of that is doing check-ins. And so we want to, do a community meeting via the chat. So in the chat, tell us your name, the organization that you are representing, and how you're feeling today. Also want to know if anybody has some great plans for this upcoming holiday season. I am so looking forward to the break. It is just, I can't wait until our last day is December 23rd at Gwen's Girls. And so just can't wait to be able to just have some downtime. So without any further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Tashara, can you go ahead and lead us and facilitate us in this time that we have together today?
Sure. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. I'm so excited because as I'm going through, I'm seeing faces of folks who join our monthly meetings. And to have you here today in the All BGEA meeting, I think is so important, and we appreciate it because we're talking about the same young people. I say this all the time. I sound like a broken record, but I'll say it once again. And so while we do our work in work groups, it doesn't mean that these systems do not interface and intercede in their lives as a whole. So thank you for joining. Please keep the introductions going in the chat. As Kathy said, my name is Tashara Halliard. I am an equity consultant, and I have the pleasure of being the BGEA and Gwen's Girls Research Coordinator. And so we wanted to start today with lifting up the policy work, and then we're going to go into the recent reports and data review for Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, y'all. So I am going to share my screen because myself and Sharice Hopkins, who has been doing the policy work with me, want to give you all an overview of where we think we are headed in 2022, but that also depends upon your feedback today. So our goal for today is for this to be a true working meeting because as a coalition, we want to ensure that your voice is at the table. Your voices are, of course, being heard as it relates to what our policy priorities are going to be for the next year. I'll say briefly, you all, that you're probably familiar with our federal policy agenda that we released at the top of this year. We really want to do that with the change of administration, feeling like there were some great opportunities with new players in town to map up the work that's already being done by the BGEA up to the federal level. And I do think that that agenda has been really helpful because it's anchored a lot of the discourse that we've had this year, including the topics that we spoke about at this year's summit. So we want to keep the party going and do the same thing at the state and local level. So I'll start off with giving you guys just an overview of what we have heard. So I should say that Sharice and I, we have conducted quite a few interviews. Some of the people who are with us today we've spoken to, and we've also leaned into the work that's already being done by the working groups, okay? So the list that you see here today, we don't mean for it to be exhaustive. However, these are items that have been the most often spoke about from members of our coalition. And the ones that are highlighted are the ones that rose to the top as far as priorities are concerned. So I'm just going to go over these very quickly. You will dig deeper in them in the breakout session towards the end of the meeting. But what we heard about child welfare for the suggested priorities are the mandated reporter training, and then updating it to include information, knowledge, awareness building around the role that implicit bias plays in our decision-making. Folks wanted to focus on the Family First Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that is meant to fund child welfare prevention or involvement prevention, and wanted to be able to draw down those dollars in a way that would be equitable. Also, folks are really interested in increasing kinship placements. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the report section so that folks can understand kind of where the data are around kinship right now in Allegheny County. Also, ensure that we are lifting up the needs of our LGBTQIA youth in that conversation as well. And then the next priority is ongoing cultural education supports during transracial adoptions, which we know we have a pretty high amount of those happening in the county, and we want to make sure that our children of color are receiving the best familiar supports that they can from a cultural lens. Other things that we've heard that are on the list are things like familiar supports to enhance healthy relationships, diversity in the social worker field, greater diversity training for staff, accountability process to address harms that youth experience while they're in the system. Also, mitigating the current challenges that are currently in the system, like non-affirming placements for our LGBTQIA youth and lack of youth agency. Also in pipelines to other systems that we know too often our young people have cross-system involvement, and then being able to ensure a greater wage for parents. So that is the list of some of the suggested priorities for child welfare. I'll turn it over to Sharice. Is this me or you? This is me. Okay. And we have Juvenile Justice here. And this work group, as you all know, has been very, very, very active. And the top three priorities that we heard were community-based countywide diversion. That is work that is already underway that you'll hear about in just a bit. The elimination of juvenile fees and fines. We've been exploring this honestly all year long, both for adults and for young people. So we'll hear about that a little bit more today. And also eliminating disorderly conduct infractions. Now, I should say that there may be things on the list of priorities that are no longer applicable for Allegheny County, but this is a state and local agenda, okay? So we have to keep that in mind. Three other points that we heard were greater intersectionality and data collection, and that really goes across all of our priorities. We need to better understand not just what's happening around race and gender, which I know was already a feat for us to get there, but also around ability, immigration status, SOGI, et cetera. Greater staff training around diversity, trauma, and secondary trauma. And then this idea came up around medical privacy for incarcerated youth. But again, the ones that are bolded are what we heard the most often. Now I'll turn it over to Sharice.
Thank you. In regards to health and wellness, the priorities that we heard, the ones that rose to the top in terms of being mentioned frequently and there being a feeling of a great sense of urgency were hygiene support. So things like having easy access for young people to obtain menstrual products, hand washing stations. So, it's also mentioned quite frequently that we're still in a pandemic. And so young people need to be able to, wash their hands and do things where they can feel confident that their hands are clean and not have to go continue touching things. Comprehensive sex education was a big one, particularly trying to make sure that there is some type of mandate. So it's something that actually has to be implemented, as well as something that is SOGI, comprehensive sex education that is SOGI affirming. And then also mental health supports, but making sure that the supports are provided are culturally competent. And so some things that came up as being part of this conversation is the need to have funding in place to train the adults who interact with young people in whatever capacity that looks like, so that they can have an understanding of youth development, of the issues that young people are facing, trauma, things of that nature, and just how to be supportive and encouraging. Greater access to mental health providers in schools was also mentioned, because that's where young people are, and sometimes that's where we're able to see where they're in crisis. And again, SOGI training and resources was something that came up a lot, but particularly in regards to mental health supports, because it was shared how if these supports are not SOGI affirming, how they can cause further harm. And if those of you aren't familiar with the term SOGI, I just want to mention it stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And then other things that came up that are important but weren't mentioned with quite the same sense of urgency or didn't come up as frequently was reproductive justice, particularly in regards to educating young people about their rights and access to services. Particularly in regards to family planning, the need for diversity among healthcare professionals, so young people can see people who look like them and who they can feel confident, understand their lived experiences, and then access to contraceptives. And then in regards to suggested priorities for education, you can see this is another area where there are quite a bit of recommendations, but unlike the other focus areas, there aren't any in bold because there weren't quite any that clearly rose to the top in terms of being a clear sense of urgency around any one or few of these or clear themes. And so that's something that Tashara will go through a bit more when she talks about the breakout group discussions, but we're hoping that the education work group can talk through this a bit more to identify which of these seems the most pressing. But to go through the list quickly, definitely a suspension ban, but trying to elevate it and make sure that there's one that takes place across the state. Removing police officers from schools and having that funding instead be used to provide for counselors and social workers and others who can provide that mental health support. Eliminating the dress code, parent engagement, and specifically how can that be obtained through policy, for example, funding for Title I, increasing teacher diversity, having equitable access to different education programs like gifted and honors and AP programs, increased accountability for student achievement. So that was something that was shared, that sometimes there's policies in place, but we need to have some accountability mechanisms to make sure that those policies are actually being implemented in an effective way. Revising truancy policy so that it can have more of a restorative focus and help young people stay connected to school instead of further pushing them out and penalizing them and their families. Removing subjective infractions that can disproportionately impact Black girls and gender expansive youth. So removing those from the code of conduct. For mandates that are in place, but there's no funding behind them, providing that funding again. So really helping for these policies that are good on paper, helping them be implemented. Training for teachers and administrators. So training, that's something again that came up across the board. And then also improving athletics programs. And so Tashira, I will turn it back to you to talk about the discussion.
And before we get to the discussion, let me just also say that we know when we say at Gwen's Girls and throughout the whole coalition, the BGEA, nothing about us without us. And so we wanted to make sure that this was not just informed by the voices of adults, but also young people. So we have developed a very short youth survey that we are hoping to get youth input on. It is going to be online. I'll make sure that I drop into the chat before the end of our meeting a link to that survey. We are using a platform called Qualtrics, but it is something that young people can access very easily online. I think there are less than 10 questions, some free response, but most multiple choice. And we just want to make sure that what we are recommending aligns with the young people themselves would like to see. And so we're about to put y'all to work, okay? Because when we get to the breakout groups, we really want to hear your input on what are the priorities that you think are the most pressing. Do the suggested ones feel right for your work group? What Changes need to be pursued at the state or local level, right? Or is it both? It just depends on what the particular recommendation is. It's important for us to be able to parse that out so we can develop a strategy to achieving it. Also, is this a matter of changing a policy or actually implementing what's already on the books? We heard that quite frequently, that some of the issues that we seek to address, there's a policy already there, it's just not being followed to fidelity. Is there already work that's happening around this? And also, who is at the table around that work? Because the question is, if we're missing people or we're missing young people, we need to make sure that they are present and participating and included in a meaningful way. Also, what are the funding needs? Who are the funders for this policy to be effectively implemented? You know, we need to head where the money resides, right? How are we going to actually get this work done? And where's the money in order for us to make it happen? Also, of course, what is possibly not on the list that should be considered? Again, what's not on the list that you feel like should be considered. And so we have a template for note taking that I will drop into the chat once we are ready to go to breakout groups, that is going to have all of these questions listed. So please do designate a note taker and fill out that template, okay? Because that's how we will collect the data from today's meeting. We have about 2 minutes, so any questions? Any questions that folks might have?
And so you all know, like this isn't a webinar, this is a meeting, so you can unmute yourself. And if you have something to say, and always you can use the chat as well. So again, we want to hear from you if you have any thoughts or comments, questions. Okay, Tashara, we ready to move? Keep it moving.
Let's keep the party going.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So next up are the recent reports and data review. And first up, we are going to hear from our child welfare work group conveners. So let me share my screen again. And we'll hear from Ms. Tawanda Clark-Edgall.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tawanda Clark-Edgall. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I am going to ask that we make this as interactive as possible. So I will be asking you to use your chat and to unmic yourself. But I'll start with the first question. Has everyone had mandated child abuse reporter training? And you can just put in the chat, yes, type it in real fast, and you don't even have to put the whole word yes. You can put why or you can put no. And so I'm seeing that the yeses are coming in. And so most people, anyone that works or touches the life of a child, absolutely has to have the mandated child abuse reporter training, right? And so it doesn't matter your profession. You could be an educator, you could be a child welfare social worker, you could work juvenile probation, a judge. You have to have this training. And so to highlight that speaks to how important this training is. So let me start off with this. I'm a storyteller, so I like to tell stories. I think it puts the data into perspective for us. So I am going to ask you, whether or not you feel like this teacher was justified in filing a report. So I have this beautiful 6-year-old little girl who comes to school with her cute little box braids and beads in her hair and beautiful brown eyes. She walks into the kindergarten classroom and the teacher looks and sees that she has a black eye. Immediately, the teacher and the teaching assistant are startled by what they see, and they say to her, "Jessica, what happened to your eye?" And Jessica says, "Roscoe did it." And the teacher looks, she's a little challenged by what she hears. And she says, "Okay, so Jessica, is Roscoe big or is Roscoe little?" And Jessica says, "Roscoe's big." The teacher goes over to the telephone, gets ready to pick up the telephone so she can call in a child line. But in the second that she's about to call it in, the teacher's assistant says, "Wait a minute." She says, "Jessica, you know what? I'm going to stop right there before I say what the teacher's assistant said. And I'm going to ask you, is the teacher justified in making a child line report?" You can, again, blow up the chat. You can put Y for yes. You can put N for no. But I need you to do it quickly because you know we don't have a lot of time. All right. So I'm seeing a lot of no's, yeses, need more information, does not record. All right, unknown, not yet. I'm seeing a lot of things. Great answers. So one of the things that we've all known is that if we've taken mandated child abuse reporter training, we know that there's a common theme, and that is that the burden of investigation is never on you, the reporter, right? You are not responsible for investigating. So it's almost like the person that you're reporting could be guilty until proven innocent if we're not careful with that. So you're right. We would want a little bit more information, but because we have that clause in this mandated child abuse reporter training that the burden of investigation is not on the reporter, a lot of times people stop right there and they go ahead and they make the call. In this particular case, the teacher's aide decided that she wanted to ask who Roscoe was. So she said, well, Jessica, who was Roscoe? And Jessica said, Roscoe is my dog. Now, I have a couple of questions for you. Was Jessica African-American, Caucasian, or Hispanic based on the way that I told that story? And you can put it in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing African-American, Black. Okay, no idea. African-American, most people are saying Black. Why did you think that Jessica was Black? Box braids. Okay, right. Absolutely. Okay, great. So you guys are already catching on. So I wanted to start this off with that story to tell you that that was an actual story, but the person that it happened to was not an African-American family. It was a Caucasian family. And so when we're thinking about mandated child abuse reporter training, that clause in the training that says that the burden of investigation is not up to you, the mandated reporter, that's fine. However, I think there should be a responsibility, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we ask additional questions before we make that report. And so just to ask who was Roscoe really made the difference in whether or not that report was made. So our group, when we started to approach this work, we looked at the idea of mandated supporting versus mandated reporting. So that shift in language right there makes it very different, because what we really want to do in this process is we want to support children and we want to support families, because we know that the best possible place for our children is to be connected to their families. That's what's most important. And so if this work is done right and we can really take a stance at mitigating the biases that we all have, they all exist. If we can take a stance at mitigating those biases, then we can really do the supporting that we need to do with families by connecting them and correcting them through resources and support. So I will say again that no, the burden of responsibility is not on the reporter, but additional questions should be. So to say all of that, the state is actually looking at this training and they're looking at it on a national level because we have disproportionality rates that exist on a national level. I am one of the people that sits on a board. I also do this training, but I asked the Pennsylvania Support Alliance one question, and that was, did we really believe that we were accurate in what we were seeing with disproportionality and why that was? So there is a deeper dive that's being looked at because everybody has to take this training. And there's a deeper look at, the way that we may phrase some questions. I just gave you an example about, when I asked you what race she was based on the way that I set it up with the box braids. Are we careful that we're not leading audiences to believe that, or participants to believe that there's a particular group of people that, should be reported instead of supported? And do we handle situations differently based on our biases with different races? So the state is looking at this work right now. They have been leaning on us for certain questions they've asked in reference to, having a statement that really represents the work that they're doing. They are really they've been tasked by the state to actually dive into this. And so at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Angela. I see a couple of things coming out.
Hi, everyone. Oh, let me turn on my video. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we always like to base our work in data and give you an idea of what our system looks like from a data-informed perspective. So this data is a couple years old. I wanted to just stick with 2019 because 2020 was such an anomaly, and so was 2021. This is really our last normal year, if you want to put it that way, but it's also the patterns that we've seen throughout the history of child welfare, especially with our Black girls. So to give you an idea of what our referrals look like coming into our system, this is both GPS and CPS. GPS is General Protective Services. CPS is the more severe allegations of abuse and neglect. Our number one reason for referral for Black girls 12 and over is truancy. But as you can see, as it goes through the child welfare continuum, so that's coming into our system. But what we actually go out and investigate, truancy falls all the way down to the 5th. That's because most of the time truancy is not necessarily a child abuse or neglect, it's more of a support issue. And so we have diversion programs and we try to address things like truancy outside of the government overseeing a family. What we can see our next reason for referral though is parent-child conflict. This is what we've seen over time for our Black girls. We see it in each one of our regional offices, and it's just been a consistent reason for referral. Parent-child conflict most of the time is normal conflict between teens and a parent. It's staying out late, it's arguments, it's things like that, not necessarily rising to the level of risk or child abuse or neglect. Once we get to investigation, though, that rises to the top reason why we're investigating. Because we've taken all that truancy out, we're still seeing a lot of parent-child conflict. Take out about a third before investigation. By the time we're accepting for service, though, we've reduced it from 143 girls coming in for this down to 31. So we're doing a lot in that first 60 days to move families out of our system and more into community-based services, things that can really address what's going on in the family, again, without government oversight into a family. And then we start to get into the things that are more neglect and abuse. So inappropriate discipline, often that's physical maltreatment, failure to protect, that's a parent who has not protected a child from someone else who has abused them, knowing that the abuse is occurring. Parental substance abuse again. Child behavioral health concerns is another one that we've seen far too much for our Black girls. We see it disproportionately for Black girls. And a lot of it is a societal views of how Black girls behaviors present. A lot of it also goes into parent-child conflict. The reason why it is concerning that we are receiving so many referrals for child behavioral health concerns is because we are not a behavioral health agency. And so what can we do for these girls to have the proper resources to address the concerns rather than coming into our net? Okay, the next one, I don't want to go too much into these, but just to give you a broad overview. So when we looked at 2019 numbers, we removed 95 Black girls ages 13 and older, which is significantly less than we had been doing in the past. If you have heard me talk before, you know CYF has been doing a lot of work around racial disproportionality. We're also bringing in community resources and things to try to reduce this. So for an entire year, 95 Black girls aged 13 and over were removed. Why this is so significant is because the number one reason we're removing Black girls is because of parent-child conflict. Again, it's the number one reason why they're coming to our attention and being investigated, and it continues on to the removals. We should not be removing a child for parent-child conflict unless there's a safety risk. Often with these cases, it's not necessarily safety, it's that by the time they've come to the attention of CYF, parents and kids are so frustrated that they can't really wrap their minds around the planning and figuring things out. And so they're coming to our attention and we're removing. So that's one area that we've wanted to focus in on and continue to focus in on for intervention before they even come to our front door, but particularly once we are working with a family, what we can use in the community so that we don't get to the point of removing children. Again, neglect for safety is one that we would look into, and most likely are reasons for removal. I mean, if a child is unsafe, we do place them into more safe environments. And then again, child behaviors, incarceration of a parent and neglect of shelter. So that's deplorable housing. Okay, can we go to the next one?
Angie,
and this is the last one of day. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just really quick, a quick question. I'm happy we're going to have some time for Q&A here, but I'm just wondering, do we know where the majority of girls 13 years and older are going that the data reflect on this slide? Just because of their age, I think one might assume group homes or congregate care, but I don't want to assume that. Do we have an idea of where they're going, where they're being placed?
That's our next slide.
Well,
Hold on, thought.
okay.
So we narrowed it down to our top 5 neighborhoods for Black girls in removal because 78 of our 95 kids came from these 5 neighborhoods. And I didn't list them here, but they're neighborhoods such as McKeesport, Penn Hills, Homewood. And so when we saw that, our top reason for removal was parent-child conflict, but our number 1 placement area was placement with kin. And this is probably the most significant change that we've seen in our system over the last few years. It used to be that most of our Black girls that were coming into care, particularly for parent-child conflict, were going to group home as their first placement. And it was only about less than 30% were going with kin. Now we have 69% are going with kin, 18% in foster care, and only 13% in congregate care. I say only 13%, but it really should say, oh my gosh, 13%, because we still want to reduce kids going into congregate care as well. And so I know I narrowed down my data because anybody that knows me knows I can talk about data for hours. But I did want to open up if there's any questions about what I've gone over today. No? Okay.
Thank you,
Well,
Angie. And so, as I said at the top of the meeting, this is an opportunity for everybody to get an overview of what's happening in the individual working groups. And so when we go into the breakout sessions and then for our future meetings, this is a topic and data that we will continue to tease out and understand, and then help DHS, CYF put some solutions to even trying to address these numbers and bring them down even further. So thank you, Angie. And
well, I was just gonna say Betsy's also here to present on just some of the topics that we've been discussing already.
I do have one question. I know you were focused on the 2019 data, but that 13% going into congregate care, do you know how much that might have been changed because of the pandemic? Were there fewer placements or kids getting moved out of congregate care because of the pandemic? And what might that offer for lowering that percentage post-pandemic if we ever get whatever the new world is going to look like?
Right. Sure. So, and Betsy's here also. She's a regional office director for my office and could talk about more of what happened during the pandemic. But absolutely, when the pandemic hit, we were moving kids out of group home. We did not want kids in congregate care settings, and that has maintained. What I can say is that leading up to the pandemic, we had already been decreasing our congregate care significantly. So we went from having over 300 kids in congregate care on any given day down to less than 100. So luckily the agency had already been focused on getting kids out of congregate care. Pandemic certainly helped. And then the focus on increasing kinship helped with that, and is another area of focus that we want to continue growing in the next year.
And I also just want to add on Betsy Cariff is the thing that helped most, we were reducing our congregate care, but our group home started closing. So crisis creates creativity. So I think it was a positive thing for our kids. Sometimes it hurts really bad trying to find placements, but we don't want them to go into congregate care anyway.
Right.
Thank you, Betsy. And then we got a question from Kip. And Kip says, question reads CYF and mandatory reporting. A 14-year-old girl tells her teacher that an adult family member who lives with the family has been abusing her sexually. She has told her mom, who doesn't want to hear it. She begs teacher not to tell anyone because someone did. And CYF was at the home and nothing was done, but she got in trouble with the adults. What should the teacher do? So it sounds like this question is aimed at what do we do when we want to hold a young person's confidence or confidentiality? Like, how does that align with mandated reporting standards and requirements?
Well, we know we have to report that. And what we're not talking about is we're not talking about those cases that need to be reported. we are not in any way negating child abuse and the fact that we need to report those cases. So that is definitely something that will have to be reported. What we're talking about is we're talking about not asking those additional questions. We're talking about the over-reporting of things that are not substantiated. Those are the things that we're looking at, and that's where disproportionality falls. This is definitely something that would be reported.
And then let me just, because I started and was typing an answer to Kip as well, is that, you know, this is unfortunately a scenario that occurs often. And as a teacher, social worker, adult reporter, you have to explain to the child that you are mandated to report that. And you can also be held liable if you don't. So. Even if it's been previously been investigated, you know, just to be safe to go ahead. We've had this happen several times at Gwen's Girls. And just an example, yes, it was reported. And then what happened was the mother moved to another community outside of the city. And so that falls outside of the city police. And so they lost track of it and nothing happened. And so now this child is in another community and has reported it. And so then we had to report it. And here to, you know, once we did, the city police was like, you know, we were, you know, we lost this case because, you know, the family had moved and they didn't have any address, didn't know where they went. And so, and unfortunately, again, some of the situations that occur where parents and youth girls are not believed, right? Because oftentimes it's the parent mother's boyfriend or somebody that's significant in the family. So all that to say, yes, it must be reported.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm also thinking about the role that adultification bias might play in a scenario like that, as far as our girls not being believed. Yeah, absolutely.
I did just want to add, though, if that concern is there, that you can include that concern with your report and it'll come to the caseworker so that they know that this is what happened before.
Any other questions?
I just want to highlight what Angela said. I think that's key in all of this is the documentation, right? So that you're documenting clearly why you believe these things are happening.
Thank you. So let me just say that the Child Welfare Workgroup has been working really hard at looking at the data around what are those key issue areas that we see that remain as far as creating inequitable outcomes for young people. If that is something that you're interested in, all of our work groups meet once a month, and we'll make sure you have those dates for 2022. One of the things that stuck out to me attending their meetings is not just the inequities that may occur because of race and gender, but also how much of a burden these calls can be on the system and the types of resources that are being used. And so we want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to ensure that the people who need the support and services are there and the ones who don't are not. So we are going to transfer over to education now. And I will share my screen for Amanda's presentation. Dr. Amanda Cross, you are up.
Thanks, Tashira. I am Amanda Cross. I'm the Acting Director of Evaluation and Research at the Office of Child Development and also the co-convener of Education Workgroup. And I am going to talk about third grade literacy scores in Allegheny County. And I will start the presentation just by saying a lot of the data that we're going to look at here are pretty discouraging. We don't have a lot of background qualitative data to explain what may be happening in some of the schools in which literacy rates are very low for Black students. And honestly, many schools have very low rates for white students as well. But I will say that this is not a Pittsburgh problem. Not to downplay the problems we have in Pittsburgh, but the national context of lagging reading scores is widespread throughout the United States. So in contrast to the gender inequity report that came out really highlighting some extreme disparities in Pittsburgh that were worse than comparable cities, in this case, Pittsburgh really does look like similar cities in the United States in terms of struggling reading scores. And so we are looking at a nationwide problem here, but we're going to zero in on the data for Allegheny County in this presentation. So why do we look at third grade reading scores as an assessment of overall educational performance, educational quality? It's because third grade reading scores are often thought of as one of the most crucial benchmarks in a child's education. I think it's really this and high school graduation that are two of the most important achievements that a child can make as they journey through K through 12. It's really at that point that students are then expected to read to learn. So after third grade, if you don't have the fundamental literacy skills, students will fall behind as they move through higher grades and they're not able to absorb educational materials through reading. But we do know that educational tests, standardized tests, are impacted by racial bias. Those biases include stereotype threat for non-white students, children of color, Black students, and also that tests are structured with white middle-class cultural bias. So those result in scores that are lower for Black students, students of color than white students. However, these scores are related to later life outcomes, and so they remain important for us to look at and to understand in framing the context of how our educational system is meeting the needs of our students. Students that don't do well on third grade reading scores are less likely to graduate from high school and therefore more likely to experience adult poverty and all the other sequelae of not getting a high school diploma. So those are public health, criminal justice consequences that come along with that. So this is a quick snapshot of reading proficiency in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh public schools. I know James is here from A+, and so he may talk more about PPS, but this is just to give a sense of African-American students in Pittsburgh and at the state level are performing about the same. So Pittsburgh students look about the same as students statewide on the PSSAs for white students, multiracial students, and Black students. So we're pretty even with the field there, although Hispanic students in PPS seem to be outperforming state levels. Hispanic students and Asian students in PPS are doing a little bit worse on the PSSA than Asian students statewide. But just to start with that framing that our, at least in the city of Pittsburgh, our students look very much like all students across Pennsylvania. And then next, we'll really look at the Allegheny County data. So we don't have an aggregated PSSA rate for Allegheny County the same way we do for PPS or for the state. So what we've done is pull PSSA scores from the Future Ready PA Index. Again, this is a couple of years of lagging. COVID interfered, obviously, with the administration of these tests, but we're pulling from 2018 scores. There are 43 districts in Allegheny County. About 21% of students who attend a school that has a third grade, so where a third grade test would have been administered, are African-American students in the county. So 7% of the districts in public school districts in Allegheny County serve a majority Black students, 50% or more Black students, and 35 districts serve 50% or more white students. And what we find is that in majority Black students, Black districts, Black students are reading at a proficiency rate at only 27% of students. So only about a quarter of Black students attending majority Black schools reach proficiency in third grade. That rate is higher for white students attending majority Black schools at 50%. Both of these are still much lower than we'd like to see. In majority white districts, Black students do a little bit better. Oftentimes in majority white districts, Black students make up a very small percentage of the total student population. And then white students are achieving proficiency at about a rate of 77% in majority white districts. So there are some disparities, obviously, there in terms of where you live and the makeup of your community, how your school on average performs on the third grade reading assessment. As we look for the range of scores across districts in Allegheny County, in public school districts, the proficiency rate ranges from a very concerning low of 16% in Duquesne City to 71% in Bethel Park for Black students. But just to note that there's about 3% of the student population in Bethel Park is African-American. It's an almost entirely white district. And on average at the district level, Black students are reaching proficiency at about 48% across all districts. The average proficiency rate is about 1/2. We looked at charter schools independently from public school districts. There's 16 charter schools in Allegheny County, and 15% of all Black students, these are estimates, attend a charter school. Proficiency rates at charter schools range from a low of 11% at Provident Charter School, which is a school specifically designed for children with dyslexia and reading difficulties, to 64% proficiency at Propel and McKeesport, which is a highlight that I'd like to point out. Students are doing well there, but on average, 36% proficiency rate for Black students in charter schools, so somewhat lower than for the public school districts. So across schools and districts, just to get a big picture of how we're doing countywide, about 60% of students, could we go back one to Shira, please? About 60% of students, Black students, attend a school where the proficiency rate is 50% or less. So 3/5 of our Black students in Allegheny County attend a school with where half of the students aren't meeting the proficiency standards. And then we have about 1/3 of Black students in Allegheny County are attending a school where 1/3 or less of Black students, so more than 2/3 of students are not proficient. So we can move on, please, to the next slide. So estimating the number of students who attend a public or charter school that contains a 3rd grade, we're looking at about 145,470 students. And of these, as I mentioned, 21% are African-American, about 31,000 students are African-American. And they are concentrated in schools that have low reading performance. So just 12% of the total number of African-American schools in students in Allegheny County attend a school where more than half of the Black students reach proficiency. So we're talking about 90% of our students, Black students, in schools where less than half of students are proficient in reading in 3rd grade. So I think those are numbers that are kind of seem like the scope is large, the problem is profound, and underscores the urgency with which we need reform. The national scope of this problem kind of indicates that we are at a cusp of really needing a deep and meaningful reform. The way that we teach students literacy now is not working. It's not working for many white students, and it's really failing many, many Black students. The science of reading literacy and teaching literacy is not being applied in the classroom and curriculum the way that it could be, and it's certainly not being done in a culturally responsive way. So we think about that as we are planning our advocacy and what we can do to fix these problems. But I did want to highlight some bright spots here. 3 Pittsburgh public schools are outperforming the overall state average literacy rate. So Black students at Allegheny Traditional Academy, at Sunnyside, and at Dilworth are all outperforming the state average. 2 of those are magnet schools and 1 is a neighborhood school. I think there's much we can learn from those programs and what they're doing to educate Black students in those contexts for success. The Pittsburgh Study Early School Age cohort has planned training for school administrators, classroom teachers, and support program staff in equity-based literacy instruction, and that's highlighting the proper mechanics of reading instruction and also identity-affirming picture books. We are in the process of doing a book drive now to raise money to distribute books in the Hill District that center Black agency, Black power, and proper reading instruction for students. And I'll put in the chat a link to that if you're interested in donating to that or in just seeing the list of recommended books that might be helpful. There's a lot of great books out there related to that are helpful for racially affirming literacy instruction. And then moving forward, we're focusing on reforming school climate to center literacy for Black children. And I'd like to close with a quote from Goldie Muhammad in her book, Cultivating Genius. She writes, "If we aim to get it right with all youth, a productive starting point is to design teaching and learning to groups of students who have been marginalized the most in society and within schools. Thus, we need frameworks that have been written by people of color and designed for children of color. Cultivating Genius provides such a framework." And so there are resources that we can build on and draw from as we move forward in looking to really make large-scale reforms as urgently as we can. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much for ending with these bright spots, because yes, these data are definitely grim. And I think all of us, we don't have to do too much work to understand how these issues around literacy really oftentimes propel our young people into other systems and adverse outcomes. So now we are going to hear from James Fogerty of A+ Schools.
Thanks to Shira, and thank you, Dr. Cross. So we know what works at a school level. It's great that we saw some bright spots. We bright spotted over the last 3 years in our report to the community a variety of schools and programs that are getting better outcomes for students. You're welcome to go to ourschoolspittsburgh.org to check those out. In some of the places where we're highlighting change, Allegheny, right? Beechwood, Dilworth, where we see all of these schools have one thing in common, or these set of things in common, right? They're centering students. They're putting the data that they have around their instruction and what's going on at the school to work, both intentionally within the school team, but also helping students to see their own data and understand what it means and what it doesn't mean. And third, they work really collaboratively, not only with each other within the building, but also with community organizations, with parents. And so that leads to better outcomes in these schools. Next slide. But rather than focusing on data, because we've had this 2-year lag due to COVID, we wanted to take a deeper dive and look at some structural issues within the district to try and understand why the outcomes we're getting are what we're getting. All of these are what I would say, we're looking at issues, and we're not saying that these are causal at all, but we are saying they relate to what other research has pointed out as problematic, right? So for us, 4 big key challenges that we identified this year in our report were segregation, and the fact that our district, and again, this isn't unlike most school systems across the country, but current school neighborhood patterns plus patterns of choice lead to concentrations of students in poverty in certain schools. The second thing is that we have a system that gives less to those that need more in general. We have more of an equal funding system than an equitable funding system. And while there are efforts to put additional dollars at some schools with high concentrations of poverty, what we see is that's not consistent across the board. And there'll be data that I'll talk about with that. Third is just access to opportunities is uneven. So economic advantages that students have become educational advantages in the current system. And finally, school attendance, right? This is one of those key ones that has an interplay, I think, a lot with the agenda that's been spoken about today, of how kids get pushed out, how that the cultures of the school may not be affirming to students, and that the relationships with parents may not be welcoming, and so the partnership between family and school may not exist, and so we see families and students not showing up. Part of it also may be because the national research shows you're just not knowing that 2 days a month of missing school, it leads to chronic absence, right? That's 18 days over the course of a school year, almost a month worth of school missed. And for many of us, I mean, and especially during COVID, where families are having to quarantine due to exposures and other things, we expect that chronic absence rates would increase in this year until there is some greater understanding around what we can do to keep kids in school in the midst of a pandemic, right? That's not gone, it's still here with us. Overall, though, one of the biggest systemic challenges that Pittsburgh Public Schools is facing, right, and again, my focus is Pittsburgh Public Schools, is the enrollment decline of 4,394 students in the last 5 years, which creates, especially as the footprint and staffing of the schools have not changed, just creates some financial pressures that I'm sure many of you are hearing about in the news. Next slide, please. So, I was, in looking at segregation within Pittsburgh Public Schools, one of the things I wanted to look at more deeply is, what is the impact of segregation on our schools? And there are lots of great work out there. I point to a work out of Stanford that really shows, look, if it were possible to create equal educational opportunity under conditions of segregation and economic inequality, some community among the thousands of districts in the country would have done so. None have. Separate is still unequal. So that while we may see bright spots in schools with high concentrations of poverty, the reality is, and kind of if you look at the data across the country, which is what their data set looks at, we're not seeing systemic improvement, especially for Black children in poverty, where they are concentrated in high concentrated buildings of poverty, right? And we see this play out in Pittsburgh public schools. White students are more likely to be the majority in schools with low concentrations of poverty, and you can see the data here, whereas Black students are almost the entire number of students in schools with the highest concentrations of poverty in our district. And, you know, if we look at decline rates, someone just mentioned this, I can speak to that for a second. Some of it is pertinent and due to charter choice, right? Some folks are making the choice to go to charters. I think that accelerated a bit during the pandemic as folks were looking for online learning or other types of learning when there were gaps in service from PPS. But there are lots of other that only accounts for about a third of the enrollment decline. About 2/3 of the enrollment decline, I think, is a mix of declining birth rates, though that hasn't been as big as some of the housing shifts. And we don't know, we can't say whether those shifts in housing are due to housing prices, pricing people out, public housing that's been closed and folks moving out of the city as a result, or as a result of folks moving for school, right? Like, the rationale and reasons for folks moving is unclear. We can say that folks have moved. We don't know exactly where they've moved. We know some of our districts and the communities surrounding us haven't seen increased enrollment. So there is a thought that some of this enrollment shift is just shifting to suburban communities as a result of folks wanting different types of school opportunities for their children. Next slide. So we have a system that, you know, is a system of both neighborhood and magnet schools where segregation gets exacerbated by redlining and community-based issues, right, around housing, wealth, et cetera. And then we have a per pupil spending formulas that go school by school that are more equal than equitable. And so what you see is schools with very high levels of poverty, and they would be in sort of the top bracket. You know, some of them, right, are in that top right quadrant, getting about $22,000 per pupil in 2019, but others that have much lower levels of poverty are getting near the same amount. What was, as an organization, we've been working very closely with Perry High School, and one of the things that was most distressing to me is seeing that Perry was at the lowest range of per pupil spending and allocation in 2019. It was a year where the new principal was definitely struggling and trying to get new programs off the ground, and had to make cuts to staffing, and due in part to enrollment decline. But what's frustrating is this is a school that has about 70%, and you can go to the next slide, about 80% of the students are in poverty, and, you know, they're getting significantly less than schools where many fewer students are in poverty, many fewer are getting, and they're getting more resources, right? So we see that Obama, Kappa, SciTech, we're getting between $1,800 and $1,600 more per pupil in 2019 than Perry was. And had Perry received the district average of appropriations, it would have gotten close to $1 million, $880,000 more per pupil for the school to be able to do things like hire more counselors, address some of the teaching areas that they needed and wanted to address, so that they don't have as many teachers teaching the maximum load. You know, when we talk about the structural changes that are needed, there's no easy answer. And so I'm not going to claim that we know exactly what's right. I would say that my belief is our communities have the answer. And so this is an opportunity with new leadership to really invest in that kind of community conversation where we design schools with the students we serve in mind, that are culturally affirming, that have the kinds of curriculum and reading programs that are going to be effective. We know how to do that. Because what we're seeing, and this slide is showing, is that, you know, economic status is highly correlated with advantage in this district, right? Gifted identification in and of itself doesn't necessarily have to create advantage. But what we see is predominantly that gifted identification flows with the concentration of economic disadvantage in a school. And so what ends up happening is white students are almost 6.5 times more likely to be identified as gifted than Black students as a result. And there have been efforts, I mean, to the district's credit, there have been efforts to try and even this out. There was a pilot program of 6 schools leveraging different types of assessment for students kind of across the board in 2nd grade to see if we could get greater enrollment and increase the diversity of enrollment across the board in our gifted programs. That didn't happen as a result of the pilot. So I think there's more to explore there. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, my goal would be as a parent in this system to design a system that provides all students with ways for them to be able to demonstrate their gifts and talents, right? The kind of fixed mindsets of gifted identification, I don't think serve our children well, and do create this kind of bifurcated set of tracks for students, right? So gifted identification in elementary school leads to, you know, project-based learning and other supports at the Gifted Center, but then also leads to an additional easier access to AP and CAS courses, our most rigorous courses, which then prepare students for college and trade school much better, and have been shown in the research to, you know, to help support persistence in college and graduation. Next slide, please. Yes, Title I funding is included in those amounts, and so that's where that's exactly the issue that we face, is that the federal dollars, whether they be Title I or other federal supports, are included in this calculation. You know, so the big thing for us is then this impacts who graduates from college or trade school within 6 years. So we looked at 2011. Who started high school. We had 1,742 students start as freshmen in our high schools. In 2015, 1,227 of them graduated. That was 70.4% four-year cohort graduation rate. 883 of those enrolled in college or trade school. So the 72% I'm listing there is not against the freshman year, but it's against the graduation rate. And then 393 completed college or trade school in 2021. Again, that 32% rate is against those that graduated, not those that started high school. If you were to do the math on the 393, it's actually 22% of the freshmen that started in 2011 graduated from college or trade school within 6 years. So we have about 1,349 students that we're not sure what happened, right? They're not in a school that the National Student Clearinghouse is tracking. National Student Clearinghouse tracks about 98% of our college and trade schools. So it's possible some are in programs that aren't covered, but almost all are. I think more likely is that they're entering the workforce in a variety of different roles and positions. And I think one of the things that, you know, both the Inflection Point study out of the Allegheny Conference and others have pointed out is the need for sort of our adult learners or our younger adult learners to upskill, to go back and get more education. I think one of the things that we're hopeful about, if you go to the next slide, you know, is that there are schools and bright spots within, even though we have these, you know, these trend lines, right? Of concentrated poverty is getting, you know, is making it more difficult for students to get to school, right? And you can start to imagine all of the reasons why that's true. But one of the things we're going to be doing at A+ in the next year is really diving in. We've been diving in at Perry for the last 3 years, working with the staff and students there to help facilitate a process to redesign that school and understand what they want. I think the same thing, right? We know if you look at this graph, you can see a dot at the very bottom between the 60 and 70% line. That's Schiller Middle School. Their chronic absence rate was 3% last year, even in the midst of the pandemic. That's really due to a whole system of things that the school building is doing. And it starts with the leader in the building and the counselor who is really dogged about tracking attendance. But every single teacher in that building has responsibility for some number of students to be monitoring their attendance, to be checking in, to build those relationships. And we see that schools, other schools, in the district that have higher rates of poverty are also seeing lower than what we would expect outcomes, right? So there's a huge range at the 80% level too, where Arsenal K-5, Arsenal 6-8, and Manchester are seeing much lower rates of chronic absence than their peers where poverty is concentrated. Sorry, Tashira, I will wrap up. Next slide. So in our mind, there are these opportunities for improvement, right? We can create diverse by design schools in leveraging community resources and community thoughts so that we can actually do what San Antonio's done, which is created integrated schools that are serving children well and reducing the concentrations of poverties and students with disabilities in each school, right? So that they're served better because they have more resources to be able to serve them. We can fund based on student need, whether that's an evidence-based formula or student-based formulas. There are different models for how to do that. We can provide access to opportunities and design schools that are opportunity rich, right? Rethinking physical spaces and enrollment criteria to create schools where it's possible to give kids access to a variety of learning opportunities. And finally, we can make families partners, right? I think in so much of this work, it's about the relationships that we build between schools, between institutions. And I think the community schools model that we're seeing both at King, we're seeing outcomes in Langley, you're starting to see those relationships being built between the community partner, the school, and the family that's starting to have some impact. So our hope is that over time, we continue to learn our way into better and address some of these issues that are structural that we believe are impacting the outcomes that we see that Dr. Cross mentioned. Thank you so much for the time and appreciate all the work you all are doing.
Thank you, James. And let me just say that this is absolutely powerful data. And we hope to hear about your work with A+ schools again next year because there's so much to dig into that we just haven't had the time to do so today. So once again, thank you. And to wrap up the education presentation, we are going to hear from 1PA. We have Ms. Paulette and Joy.
Good afternoon. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Because sometimes this computer decides to do what it wants to do. So just giving you an update of who we are. 1PA, Education Rights Network, is comprised of dedicated group of parents and caregivers who are working to ensure equity and inclusion for our students in Pittsburgh Public Schools. In addition to reviewing and analyzing suspension data and raising awareness of the issue, we work to educate and support our parent leaders via Know Your Rights workshop and direct help in investigating and navigating the District Code of Conduct, a discipline procedure. Education Rights has successfully mobilized and supported parent leaders to rally for necessary changes to the district's discipline policy and practices, and has achieved winning, including the ratification of some of the recommendations changed in the district's code of conduct. I say all that to share that we are an organization of grassroots. We rely on the stories of our parents to get the work done. We look at what they have experienced in order for them to be able to know what to do and how to achieve it. As you can see by our first slide, we hold different workshops. And one of our campaigns, several of our campaigns is Counselors Not Cops, community schools. And just to give an understanding on that, actually 1PA was one of the leads in getting the community school agenda brought to the district in a way that would benefit those schools that have applied for that status. So far, we have 9 community schools. And yes, there's a need for a great deal more resources. Our biggest concern was Counselors Not Cops. We went to Harrisburg to fight for that conversation. We even went to as far as meeting with Jake Wheatley and the representative from Philadelphia also saying, hey, we need some form of policy brought to the attention across the states that our children are being criminalized at an early age as pre-K. So with that being shared, back in 2015-16, we set out with the help of Annenberg Foundation to go and do research in regards to what took place. We continue moving forward with another research organization. I wanted to also add that I'm a co-founder along with, at the time, where Pam Harbin was a part of that. She now has transitioned into the Board of Education, and her voice has rung heavily in a lot of things that we've done, because the awareness that was brought was the push that we got to get our parents involved. We got to make sure that our parents know that they have a voice and their needs to move forward. So when our children are being impacted, when we're getting calls from parents saying, hey, my child's getting ready to get suspended just for not showing up on time, my child's being suspended because we may have a home situation here, that became a concern when we saw the number of students being suspended based on what the code of conduct was stating. And we had to make sure that our parents knew that there was a code of conduct, but they need to be aware of. So we often try to, when we hold our tabling events, we often would share with them, hey, do you know there's a code of conduct book? Are you aware of what can take place if your child does A, B, C, and D? How do you want to make a voice be heard? So when the district was having their conversation with parents and community several years back, understanding PBIS, understanding the level of infractions, we made sure that we had people at those tables so that they could have their voices be aware of that. So what I'm going to do is pass it over to Joy. Joy is our education organizer, and she is going to give you some updates from our 18-19 Code of Conduct suspension report. As we shared, we started out in 2015, 16 getting this information, and now we're moving into the 2019, 17, 18, and 19. Again, like everyone has shared here, the conversation about getting things to a point that is best serving our students and our parents, because we always want to put our parents first and our students also, because they get lost in the sauce. They're often left with, oh, did you not know that? Well, we're sorry. Well, we don't want that to continue to be the conversation that is being heard by the district. And so that is why we want to make sure that they're aware. So Joy, she can go from that point and share.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joy Evans. I'm the education organizer with 1PA, and I'm going to highlight some of the data that we found in our most recent work with the suspension report. So what this first chart shows is the disproportionality in suspensions, and we're looking at 2018 and 19 by race. So what this shows is the number of students enrolled versus the percentage of students enrolled, versus the percentage of students suspended in each racial category. So one thing that we found was Black girls are suspended at 4 times the rate of their white counterparts, while Black males are suspended at 5 times the rate of their white counterparts. And what this data shows is that African Americans make up 53% of the total enrollment, however, make up 80% of suspensions that happened during the 2018-19 school year. And as you can see on this chart, the white students made up 29% of the total enrollment, while only 10% of the suspensions for that school year. So we can see how there's inequities in that, in the fact that there's only 53% of African Americans, but they clearly were suspended more than one time because they're 80% of the total suspensions for that year. And this next chart is going to show you the total suspensions by race and gender for the 2018-19 school year, and we're looking at grades K through 5 specifically. So this shows African Americans lost the most days of in school most days of instruction for out of school suspensions, and they missed 765 days for the 2018-19 school year versus the African American females who missed about 403 days due to out of school suspension. And then it also, what I found interesting was that African American females, because we talk about how Black girls a lot of times face a lot of inequities in schools. This chart shows that while they only were suspended about half amount of the time as African American males, combined, they were suspended more than all the other racial groups combined. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting piece to look at, just in how things aren't, fair, pretty much. You can go to the next slide, please. And then now we're going to look at the percentage of students suspended at least once in grades K through 2 versus 3 through 5. And this is broken down by race, gender, and IEP status. So what this shows is that African American males with an IEP in grades K through 2 were suspended at a percentage of 8.7%, while African American males with an IEP in grades 3 through 5 were suspended at a percentage of nearly 16%. And this is about double what their white counterparts would be suspended. And that's just with an IEP. And then in 2018 and 19, students with disabilities in all race groups and gender groups were suspended at rates higher than their peers without disabilities. So that's something that we always pay attention to, like when we're talking about equity, or kids that have IEPs or some kind of disability being targeted more based on something that may be a result of their IEP. And then in total, we found that 204 K through 5 students with disabilities missed 512 days due to suspensions. And out of that, African American students accounted for 159 of these 159 of the students with IEPs, and they missed 410 days of instruction due to suspensions. So you can kind of just see how definitely African American males are the ones that are missing more days in school due to being suspended over any other group. And then white students are typically the least suspended out of everybody else. And this is just in 2018-19. And then this other chart is going to show the suspensions versus a type of offense. So when we talk about the code of conduct, we talk about non-violent offenses versus violent offenses. And I'm gonna go back to the 2016-2017 because I found something interesting. In 2016 and 17, there was a category called disruption of school. And that was considered a minor non-violent infraction category. And at that time, it accounted for 70% of suspensions in total. And then moving forward to 2018-19, that category was removed and there was a new category added that was aggression and what was it? I'm sorry, give me 1 second. It was physical aggression and altercation. And that was added to the code of conduct in 2018-19 and considered a violent category. So what we found was that in 2018 and 19, 45% of suspensions were in this new category that was now considered a violent category versus there was a lot more suspensions before for non-violent things. And now, like after the ban happened, it seems that maybe like they were just categorizing things differently and being able to suspend under this new category by calling something a violent infraction that maybe once was a non-violent infraction. And then, like we said, from 16-17 to 18-19, there was a drastic decrease in suspensions. However, we noticed that there were, I lost where was that? There were more in this new category added. So I think that that's something that we need to look more into Like, we're not really sure if because of like the change in categories that now they're just calling things something different and still being able to suspend. And then we know that like more recently, they were trying to reverse the ban and go back to being able to suspend for things that were nonviolent. So it's a good thing that that didn't happen, because we see that like there was a big change in how much they were suspended versus how many suspensions are occurring now. But we still see that it's still more African-American students that are being suspended overall. So nothing really has changed in that regard. Let me see if there's anything else I want to highlight. And I think that that is all I'm going to highlight right now due to time constraints. Ms. Paulette, was there anything you wanted to follow up with?
Okay, our main concern is that when it comes to students who are being targeted based on non-violent behavior, it had caused more of a disruption in our concern, due to the fact that when our children are coming to school, based on the conversation that was said in the social work break conversation, when a student is coming to school, from what they have no authority or ability to stop, they're being held accountable for behaviors that should be addressed through someone going in and finding some care for the situation. When they're and sometimes a child is challenged even with a disability. What we find with students with exceptionality, with the disabilities, the manifestation of that disability causes a concern that often is not being met, and then we're left with that child being pushed out of class, and again, learning loss for them also. So when it comes to non-violent, when it comes to violent behavior, that's a whole different category that has to be done with the PBIS, positive behavior instruction, and going through what's necessary for the students to be restored. Our biggest issue is that we have programs that are in place, yet they're not being utilized based on the fact that resources are not available. That has been this whole blow up when they wanted to reverse the suspension ban because of students returning back to school, and they became disruptive. And then they wanted to utilize this particular disruption of behavior, of property or different things to cause this ban to take place. The issue is that we did not begin to bring them back into community. So the end result is that they're suffering from disconnect. So our biggest issue is that we want to make sure that our children are being brought back into community. And so we're going to wrap up from that point. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Paulette and Joy and 1PA for just all the amazing work that you do. So we're going to wrap up the education portion of the data reports. But can I just say, I'm sure you all understand why it was difficult for Sharice and I, just through the interviews and our research, to determine what the highest priorities are for the policy work in 2022, because there is so much work to be done. So now we are going to switch over to juvenile justice. And first up, we have Dr. Sarah Goodkind, Kimberly Booth, and also Samantha Murphy to talk to us about JPO referrals and truancy data for 2020.
Thanks, Tashira, and thank you, Ms. Paulette and Joy, especially for highlighting how, things that were previously classified as non-violent are now being reclassified as violent to kind of work around this suspension ban, because I think it's so important that, the whole point of that change is to reduce suspensions, and that is making them not be reduced as they should. So thank you. And I think that's a good segue to what we're going to talk about. Kim, are you here too? It's so hard when you can't see everyone with the, do you want to say anything, Sarah, or do you want me to start, Kim?
No, I think we can, I can add anything when we go into our breakout. So you can go ahead and start. Thanks, Sarah.
So we are focusing on referrals to the juvenile justice system, also called JPO, in Allegheny County. And Kim and I are the co-conveners of the Black Girls Equity Alliance Juvenile Justice Workgroup. So those of you who have been at previous BGEA meetings know that our juvenile justice workgroup has been focused on referrals really since we started our work, right? Because what we discovered when we first came together was that this is the point at which we have the most racial disproportionality in the juvenile justice system in our county. It's at that referral point, also called allegations. And what we've been talking about since the beginning, and you all have heard us talk about before, is how much worse this racial disproportionality is in Allegheny County than in the US as a whole. We are not going to rehash our report that came out in 2020. I think we can drop the link for that if anyone wants to look at that. But we just wanted to put one point from that report at the beginning of what we're talking about today, which is that all of our collective work has revealed that a really large proportion of the referrals to juvenile justice of Black girls in our county are coming from the schools. And in 2019, we saw for Black girls more than for any other group that this really large proportion of juvenile justice referrals are what are coming from schools or are school related offenses. And so what we've been looking at this fall in the juvenile justice work group is to try to think about and understand what happened when many students in Allegheny County were not attending school in person during the pandemic. So we started to look at 2020 data and to compare it with 2019 data. Of course, that's not a perfect comparison because, you know, most kids were in school at the beginning of 2020, and then the pandemic has obviously extended beyond that. But this is just a starting point for us. And I want to thank Alex Fixler, who's a doctoral student in the School of Social Work at Pitt, who has helped us with looking at this data this fall. And I also want to point out that the data that we're sharing today is all pulled from the Juvenile Justice data dashboard, which is on the DHS website, and any of you can take a look at that anytime. So, Tashira, if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so as I said, we were looking to compare the number of referrals to JPO from 2019 to 2020. And this is showing the percentage decrease for all of these groups. And what you can see on this slide is that referrals overall decreased from 2019 to 2020, and they decreased most for Black girls. In fact, were cut almost in half. So if we could go to the next slide, please. These next two, then we separated out the referrals that were for school-related offenses, which will be after this, and then first non-school related referrals. And so this slide, again, shows a drop in referrals for all four of these groups that are not related to school. These are things that happened in the community. And then if we could go to the next slide, we showed that to show that you know, those drops were important, but the really large drops came from school-related referrals, right? Again, not surprising since many young people were not in school at all or very little during the year, but we see, again, the most substantial decrease for Black girls, but large decreases for all groups of young people. And if we could go to the next slide. So this slide, oops, thank you. This one is looking, so the prior slides were overall numbers of referrals, but those of you who have looked at the work we've been doing throughout, we like to calculate referral rates. And that means the number of young people in that particular group per 1,000 young people aged 10 to 17 in our county, right? Because if we really want to understand how different groups of young people are being treated differently, we need to look at the rate and not just at the overall numbers. And that's where things start to look different, because in Allegheny County, there are many more white young people than there are Black young people. Okay, so this slide, which is maybe a little bit confusing, and I'll try to explain, just shows decreases in the overall rates of referral for all groups from 2019 to 2020. And then these other numbers are just showing the rate of racial disproportionality. So some of you might remember from our last report that in 2019, Black girls were referred at 10 times the rate of white girls to juvenile justice in our county. And you can see that where it says the 10 times on this slide. With the decrease in referrals, and especially for Black girls, where so many of the referrals were coming from schools, the rate of racial disproportionality between Black and white girls decreased just a little bit, or to 8 times in 2020. Still super problematic. And we know from lots of the investigations that we've been doing, right, that behaviors can't account for these differences. But so this is where we were starting to just see what happened during the first part of the pandemic. And so if we could go to the next slide, please, Tashira. This is our takeaways and next steps. So as we saw on the slides, right, referral rates for Black girls were cut in half when they were not in school. And we also started to look at, and I will just say that Alex really did some, started to look at specific offenses and also specific communities for us. And so we have lots more data than we're showing here today. We just don't have time to go through all of it, but I want you all to know that our work group is looking at this so we can understand things more specifically. But one thing we saw, we know that a lot of the referrals that are coming from schools are often related to fighting. And so we looked, for example, at referrals for simple assault, which is usually part of a fight. And we saw that the non-school related referrals for Black girls for simple assault stayed the same from 2019 to 2020. There were 28 of those each year. Whereas the school related referrals of Black girls for simple assault dropped from 80 in 2019 to just 13 in 2020. So that left us with a question that I think we've all been asking for a long time, but we wanted to put that here again. How can we make our schools safer and more supportive for Black girls? Our next steps and things we want to better understand is what is happening now that most students are back in school this school year. So we're going to try to take a look at that. We're going to hope to work some with Melanie King, who I think is on the call today, because she can help us. In the data dashboard, we can't do it by school year. We can only pull by calendar year. So we need to do some more work looking there. As I said, we have been also looking more closely by neighborhood because the juvenile justice referrals of Black girls, and in fact of all youth, dropped in almost every neighborhood in 2020, except we actually saw increases in Clairton and Carrick. So we want to understand what's going on there and how we can get the referrals to decrease there as well. And the last thing we want to mention, and I don't know if Sam is going to talk a little bit about this, but you know that one of the main things that has come out of this collective work this year, or from all these years, is this request for proposals for pre-arrest diversion in Allegheny County. And I think we have it on the next slide, or maybe I didn't get that in here in time, I'm not sure. Yes. You did. And so maybe Kim or maybe Sam want to talk a little bit about that.
I do see Sam. I would suspect she wants to talk about our biggest take at the end of the year, which was the whole widespread diversionary project. Sam, I think I see.
Let me just say, I'm sorry to Sam, that this is around the diversion work. It's also one of the suggested priorities that you all will be discussing in your breakout group. So Sam, feel free to be brief here, and if folks have questions, they can ask them in the breakout group.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just to mention, the Department of Human Services released a request for proposals due the week after Christmas. for an agency to help coordinate both an intake, a funnel, to be an opportunity for kids to get supports and services in not arrest or citation, and to really influence that system change that at our police, at our school police, at our community police around how to be more helpful, less punitive response to behavior concerns. So I look forward to the breakout and talking about it more.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you to Sarah. Kim, did you have any other thoughts or final conclusions you want to share with us?
I don't. I think we did a nice little summary. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. And again, the Juvenile Justice Workgroup has been very hard at work all year long outside of their monthly meetings, also hosting other meetings and campaigns and initiatives specifically around diversion. And so if that is work that you were interested in, we hope that you will join them in 2022 and also join their breakout group in just one moment. But now we are going to turn it over to Gada of the ACLU to tell us a bit about their work and their reporting on student arrests.
Hi, thank you. Yes, Gada Makushi from the ACLU. So we finalized a report, Student Arrests in Allegheny County Public Schools, the Need for Transparency and Accountability. And while the report is final, our comms department is still prettying it up. So we will send the link as soon as they've finished that and published it. But in our report, what we look at is arrest rates and disparities of youth in Allegheny County by race, gender, disability, and most serious alleged charge. We also look at the limitations of available public data on student arrests, the underreporting of student arrests by school district, and then we do have a spotlight on Pittsburgh Public Schools, which is the largest school district in this county, and then we wrap it up with recommendations. I do want to clarify that this report only looks at school-related arrests, not arrests of youth in the entire community. And we focused on 2017, 2018, and 2018-2019 school year since COVID cut the 2019-20 school year short for in-person, even though I will note that if we looked at the data in March compared to previous years, 2019-2020 was on track to have the same, if not higher, arrest numbers than previous years. So the goal of our report was to inform school administrators, board members, parents, student stakeholders about the details of which groups of students are disproportionately arrested and about gaps in data reporting. And then we wanted to provide guidance on how to address these issues. And so if you go to the next slide. So these were some of our key findings. School districts in Allegheny County underreported arrests to the civil rights data collection by 83% for the 2017-2018 school year. Pittsburgh Public Schools, again, which was the largest school district, reported 0 arrests to the CRDC and then 86 arrests to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, when juvenile court data showed they had about 499 arrests for the 2017-18 school year. Nationally, Black students are arrested at rates that are more than twice the representation in the student population. Within Allegheny County, Black students are arrested at rates that are over 3.5 times the representation in the student population. So overall, Pittsburgh Public Schools and Stowe Rocks topped the list with regard to arrest rates for all students, but it was actually school districts like South Allegheny, Baldwin-Whitehall, and Moon area, which had very small populations of Black students, that had the highest rate of Black students arrested and the largest gap between arrests of Black students and white students. Overall, within Allegheny County, Black boys were the most at risk of school-related arrests, with 1 out of every 51 Black boys arrested, compared with 1 out of 316 white boys arrested. Black girls were arrested at alarmingly high rates. So 1 out of every 69 Black girls arrested, compared with 1 out of every 894 white girls. Students with disabilities under the IDEA in Allegheny County were also arrested at higher rates, so about 3 times the rate of students without disabilities within Allegheny County. compared to twice the rate nationally. And a quick note here that arrest rates of students with disabilities may in fact be higher than what we're reporting, but since arrests are so underreported across the board, it's really hard to get an accurate number nationally and in the state. Next slide, please. So why is it important for school districts to report accurately? The underreporting of student arrests is a problem that isn't just a Pennsylvania problem. I mean, this includes large districts such as New York and LA, and they are not being held accountable for underreporting. Within Allegheny County, we do have things like Bird's Eye View, the Juvenile Offense Dashboard, resources that aren't readily available in other cities. However, they have limitations. Bird's Eye View only reports for the city of Pittsburgh, and it doesn't differentiate between what is a school or a community arrest. The Allegheny County Juvenile Offense Trend, while the most accurate source, only reports referrals to juvenile court by neighborhood and not by school district. Neither site provides data on arrests of students with a disability. So the civil rights data collection is really the only source of this data, and it's vital that school districts report student arrests and referrals accurately. So the data shortcomings raise serious concerns about whether Black students and students with disabilities are receiving the protections from discrimination guaranteed by law. And while this presentation right now, I'm not talking about Pittsburgh public schools, in our report, we spotlight PPS. And the reason we do that is not just because they're the largest district, but also that they were unique and that they reported multiple times through meetings, through right to knows, through state and federal data, et cetera, data on arrests and summary citations, and in almost every single case, the data provided was different every time. So if you can go to the next slide. So as noted in the Lost Opportunities report from the UCLA Center for Civil Rights Remedies, widespread reporting noncompliance has meant that the public cannot tell how often most districts call upon police and security to enforce school rules. Without reliable public reporting of the data, the true extent of the school policing disparities and their impact on students by race and disability remains hidden. So without a substantial improvement in the collection or reporting of the school policing data, it will remain difficult to evaluate any reform efforts, right? If we don't know what the actual numbers are, we can't tell if any of the efforts that we're making are having an impact. And honestly, it shouldn't be this difficult to try and find accurate, reliable data on student arrests. So as you go through our report, all of the data that's involved in there that's included is not easy for the average person to be able to find, right? We had to work with different organizations to get additional data. In fact, I had to call a few police departments to confirm some of the data. So there was a lot of cross-checking and multiple data sources to be able to put together this report. And this is stuff that most people would not have access to or have the time to be able to do. And so what schools report is vital so that the community, the parents, the students know what's actually happening. Finally, if you go to our last slide on recommendations. So what we are recommending is, things that I'm sure other people have also recommended: restrict police involvement in ordinary school discipline, decisions made by school staff, police, and prosecutors play significant roles in driving the disproportionate arrest of Black students and students with disabilities, as well as in increasing the severity of specific charges brought against them. And so when I say that, in our report, we also talk about how Black girls and Black boys, particularly Black girls, are disproportionately charged with riot when there is a group fight, even if there was no injury. And riot can be issued when more than 2 girls are fighting and do not immediately cease upon official order from police. So it doesn't mean that they were actually inciting a riot. It doesn't mean that anyone was actually injured. And it's the same thing with disorderly conduct. In almost every arrest of a Black student, disorderly conduct was added to the charge, to the list of charges. So eliminate the standing presence of police in schools, right? Restricting them to involvement in emergencies and dangerous incidents. Reinvest funds used for police into student support resources, including funding for school psychologists, nurses, social workers, and counselors. Relying on police is an easy way out for adults, but it does not provide students with the supports and the resources that they need to learn, to do better, to grow. And so what we're saying is take the time, reinvest these funds, and truly support the students that are in your school. Adopt a moratorium on the issuance of summary citations to students. And we go into that more in the report, but again, there's no benefit to issuing a summary citation. Students don't learn anything from it. It becomes a burden on their families, and it's something that stays on their record. So again, learning from mistakes is a normal part of adolescent behavior. And the regular presence of police in schools, as we've seen from multiple reports, leads to increased rates of student arrests, particularly for Black and Brown children and students with disabilities. And then we talk about data, ensuring that the data on student arrests and referrals to law enforcement are accurate and reported to the public, that the Every Student Succeeds Act annual report card contains up-to-date data. So if you were to go to the SS scorecard right now, it would tell you that it was reporting on the latest year. But if you go into the fine print, it actually says that it is pulling arrest data from the 2015-2016 civil rights data collection. So it has not been updated. And then even when it will be updated, it'll be the 2017-2018. Ensure that local education agencies implement with fidelity the assessments and interventions guaranteed by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Our report is about 34 pages, not including the appendix. So there's lots of detail, there's a lot of tables, there's a lot of charts, a lot more than what I've covered here, and it should be available in January, but I will end on this note.
Thank you so much, Gada. And it's so interesting because we heard the ways in which the school's code of conduct can be used to kind of bend to get to widen the net around infractions. And the same thing has been true here as it relates to arrests. So much work to be done. Please do share the report with us once it is analyzed by the department, and we'll be sure to send it out to the entire network. Okay, so next up, we're going to hear from our health and wellness work group, who are going to share some data and a presentation with us about comprehensive sex education efforts and also culturally responsive school mental health training. This is going to be our last report out before our breakout groups, and I promise we will give you all a break as well, okay? Sorry for holding you hostage, but I'll turn it over now to Jose, Dr. Brittany Brinkman, and Dr. Brian Sims.
Thanks, everyone. We're happy to be with you today. I'm going to actually have Jose kick us off talking about comprehensive sex ed. So, Tashira, if you could do the next slide.
Great. Hello, everyone. Great to see familiar faces and hear all that great data. This kind of first piece is just kind of our overview of how we've been approaching our efforts for our health and wellness group. We found that, the more we reach out on the myriads of topics, today we're really focused on this mental health piece and the sexual health piece. But, it's hard for us to get the minimum standard of what we want. So, if asking for the minimum is a hard press, we figure why not ask for all the things that we want, because we don't want the minimum for our girls. That's why we have these meetings, right? It's not just so we can get that bare minimum standard, but even more. So this kind of came just through many conversations and just really just building off kind of this general hierarchy of needs that everybody kind of has as human beings, right? I feel humanity is something that's often forgotten in these conversations and leads to most of these issues we talked about today. right? When we start looking at children as numbers, as dollar signs, as problems, as things to fix, then we run into lots of these negative outcomes. So we're really looking at this kind of social emotional learning piece, you know, looking at what healing really looks like inside of all these different settings. We really do focus a lot on these school settings, this trauma and mental health services, and just centering on what these children's experiences have been, not neglecting the fact that, you know, race is a part of what we're talking about, gender is a part of what we're talking about. So anti-racism training, which any of you who have worked in schools or any institution or just live or have been in Pittsburgh realize a huge issue, not just here, but I'd say especially here. Trafficking prevention and healing centered response. So, you know, lots of people are doing this work in Pittsburgh, most notably in my mind, Gwen's Girls has been doing really great work around that. These school health services, these basic services that seem to get cut so often, just having a school nurse, as the shower brought up earlier, she was in the shower when we were talking about some of the basic things that we're looking for, just pads and tampons, right? Just hand washing, like just really basic, very basic services that we're still asking for. You know, these restorative practices, which PPS, quote unquote, does. Maybe I'm using air quotes wrong. But they don't, they're not really, we know in practice doesn't happen consistently throughout the school district. And making sure we're looking at bias-based discrimination prevention, because as all the folks before me have talked about, bias is such a huge part of what's coming in these conversations over and over again. How is behavior of a Black girl or a Black boy treated differently than that of a white boy or a white girl, or somebody with a disability, or somebody that comes from a certain social economic background that is treated differently because they're already coming with that stigma, unfortunately, even at young ages. So I just wanted to kind of start with this just to kind of paint a picture about where we're going with, you know, not only with the sex ed work, but also with this mental health work and with all the work we're doing in health and wellness group, because all these pieces are part of being human and what our children need, and adults for that matter. You can go to the next slide. So after I'm done here, I'm going to put a link to our shared draft folder. We're not really heavy on our slides today, so we're going to make sure it's kind of short and just really jump into our subgroups as soon as we can. When I put that in the shared draft folder, you should all be able to have access. I also put my email address in there just in case you don't. Just because we do have a lot of reports and data and other things to kind of just show what we're looking to do and the why behind why we're looking to do what we're doing, which I think is really important. You know, the one report that we always highlight is the one that we did for the Black Girls Equity Alliance. That really looks at some of the background around sexual health education in the United States. You know, some of the things that, you know, folks who might not have any real ideas around what comprehensive sex ed understand, just the history of Black folks in this country, right? Starting off as, you know, with our ancestors as enslaved Africans, and all the horrible things that have been done since then. And a lot of that involves taking away that bodily autonomy from both men and especially, I'd say, women, you know, from during chattel slavery all the way into, you know, gynecology, the study of gynecology being based off of torturous treatment and experimentation on Black women's bodies and Black women. So, you know, and those legacies continue even now as we see big fights going on in the Supreme Court around abortion access, which is something that's very been moralized and religiosity. They put a lot of things in there that I feel really take away from just what some of the facts are, as far as just like people need to have freedoms to make their own personal choices and what's best for them. You know, so you know, when we look at just kind of the national landscape, you know, we know that in the United States we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the developed world. So Black women are 4 times more likely to die from childbirth or complications than white women. So when we see how terrible the care is whenever women actually carry a pregnancy to term, and then we cut out any options as far as, you know, whether they want to go to term with the pregnancy, and then before that take away options for them to have access to birth control. And before that, cut around any access for them to even have information about what birth control is and what their options are around birth control and family planning, right? So we just, we have this deck stacked very high against folks, not even just in success in their lives, but just in survival, just in living. Once again, that bare minimum of just, being able to take breath for another day. The report that we did really focused on some of that stuff on a national level, and we see a lot of things on a national level being mirrored locally. When we look at a national level, we look at the top 25 states in the country that have the highest Black populations. Only 11 of those states actually mandate sexual health education, and only 3 require that the information presented is medically accurate, which seems like a ridiculous thing to say, that there's national policy, that there's statewide policy, that one won't mandate sex ed, and that would mandate sex ed, and wouldn't mandate that it be medically accurate. Like, what is education if it is not accurate as far as the information that's being given, right? And we see this fight going on in other rooms as well, beyond just sex ed, right? Even around critical race theory and other things, like our history doesn't need to be accurate. It just needs to, sound nice. I don't actually know what their mission is, but we see this fight going on all over the place inside of our schools about not providing real education to our children, real information. And we see this mirrored locally. So the Blackest schools with the highest the highest population of Black students, because we do know that Pittsburgh public schools have a very segregated, system. So the schools where it's majority Black do not have structured sex ed curriculum. Now, when we don't have structured sex ed curriculum, what we have is inequality, right? Inequity. We get, every student is not getting the same thing, and some students are not getting anything. And we're seeing how problematic it can be. We did lots of interviews with students, and they really shine light on the issues around conversation not being inclusive, or LGBTQ students not feeling included in the conversation, information not being comprehensive, right? Not talking about birth control, not talking about condoms, only talking about abstinence, and sometimes not even talking about that, and we know that not having access to these things lead to worse sexual health outcomes. We highlighted just some of the general markers that we have around sexual health outcomes, which usually are unintended pregnancy and STIs. Sorry, I'm scrolling through so I can actually give you the actual numbers and not my guess. Oh, here we go. In Allegheny County, we have 4.2 white teens births per 1,000, versus for Black teens, we have 32.7 births per 1,000. So we see this huge gap just in that. And we also see higher rates. So Black females in the 15 to 24 year age group are disproportionately affected by STIs, representing 19% of cases in 2017, but only 1% of the total population in Allegheny County. So that's a huge overrepresentation. And I do want to bring out the fact that these are not the only things that we want to look at. There are other outcomes that we're looking for our girls that aren't often measured, because all this work is very stigmatized and often minimizes what we want as whole humans, right? So some measurements that we really want to start focusing on more and looking at for our girls are, are they in healthy relationships? Are they have absence of violence in their life and in their relationships? Their feelings of agency and positive constructions of sexuality. There's a really great article in the draft, which I will share out in a moment, around reframing sexual health for Black girls and women in HIV and STI prevention work. And it's really fascinating to me. I hate to use the word common sense, but just very sensible in its approach about how, talking about pleasure and having a positive approach to sexuality education is so important, not just because it's a nice thing to do, which it is a nice thing to do, actually acknowledging the fact that pleasure is the reason that people engage in sexual activity sometimes, and pleasure being a positive outcome that can happen from sex does actually lead to better outcomes when we even look at STI rates and preventing unintended, because we give people more agency when we talk about things from a strengths-based approach and not just from this negative approach of don't do this or you'll get HIV, don't do this or you'll get pregnant, don't do this or you'll get other STIs, right? We say, you know, if we do this, then we can have more pleasurable experience. If we do this, we can have healthy relationships. If we do this, you know, we can build our own self-esteem. So really trying to shift the way we talk and look at these things is so important. And I love that when I look at, you know, over the years, how we talk about sexual health education, the folks that are really leading the charge at really making this inclusive and really including all of somebody's humanity, it is Black women who are doing this. And I think it's worth noting that because they do not represent the majority of who is doing the work in this country. They do not represent the majority of folks who are getting the big funding to do this work in this country. But they are doing a lot of the great movements that I feel are necessary, especially for Black girls. So, you know, really looking at that overall culture shift is something that's really important. One thing that we're looking at, we'll talk about this in the subgroup, is just trying to build out more measurements that we can have for internal and external providers of sex ed inside of schools to make sure that they are competent in what they're doing. We know that it's not just about having the right curriculum, but also the right facilitator to be able to bring that curriculum out. You know, somebody who has, you know, unapologetic homophobic and transphobic ideas is not suited to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity, right? And in my opinion, to talk about anything around sexual reproductive health, and also in my opinion, to work around children at all. But you know, really making sure that we're looking to make sure that folks who are doing this work are able to do the work, and those that aren't able and want to, that we can train them up and get them where they need to be and give them the resource they need to get that there, right? And also making sure that we're not just doing that for teachers, but also for families, caretakers, organizations, right? Everybody who's working with young folks, you know, we are the village, right? Making sure that they're also getting those resources, whether it be education or whatever supports they need, as well as making sure that there's access to services like STI testing and birth control. So these are some of the things that we're really looking at when we talk about the sexual health of Black girls here. I'm going to drop this link inside of here for anybody who wants to look at some of the things. This is for all the health and wellness work, and it's continually being added to. We have some great things to show what a statewide policy can look like. That's some of the work we're trying to work towards as well. And so please join us in our breakout group today, and we will give you so much more information and answer some questions if you have any.
Thanks, Jose. So, you know, we know that the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of existing problems as well as inequities. And one of those areas is regarding mental health. So the U.S. Surgeon General put out this recent report talking about and highlighting concerns about mental health amongst youth in the United States. And a lot of it is raising awareness of the increasing challenges that we're seeing our young people experience around mental health. Pre-pandemic, we saw a lot of these things growing, and then acknowledging the impact of the pandemic on kids. So not being able to go to school, trying to attend online, worrying about the health of themselves and their family members, and just really, and then, you know, more trauma that a lot of our kids were facing before the pandemic that has added in. So in a 2019 survey, we saw that the rates of both actually diagnosed levels of depression, but also just self-reported feelings of sadness, hopelessness, other symptoms related to depression have increased by 40% since 2009. So half of female respondents are reporting that. We've also seen increased rates of suicide and suicidality, particularly among young Black children, even below the age of 13. Really, really concerning. We know that all of the things that impact mental health for our girls include things like systemic racism, sexism.
Oh no, did we lose Brittany?
I think we've had a, oh, she's back.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Got kicked out. So we know like systemic inequalities that our girls have faced. We've talked in this group a lot about impacts of trauma and the need for all of us who work with Black girls to work from a trauma-informed lens. But I think it's also really important that when we talk about this work in our group, we're talking about these specific challenges around mental health, but really our goal is to create opportunities for Black girls to thrive. And we're really thinking about mental well-being, right? So how are we giving girls the tools to face sort of the tasks of living, right? For most of them, it's going to school. Sometimes they're doing part-time jobs, having energy and excitement, enthusiasm for hobbies, for their interests, for thinking about their relationships, their future career goals. So we definitely want to address these things that are concerning, but we also really want to be working towards a really positive space for our girls. Tashara, can you do the next slide? So one of our subgroups of the health and wellness group is really focusing on mental health, and we're taking a three-pronged approach. So we think it's crucial to be focusing on what are the direct supports and resources that we have available and that we can build up and bolster and support for Black girls in our region. Some of the groups, some of you on here, many of y'all's organizations are doing this work directly. So how do we build that work up? And then part of that is training the adults who work with girls. So are we offering culturally responsive mental health support for the adults, whether they're, I'm a licensed psychologist, people do not need to know how to do the work that I do, but any adult who interacts with Black girls need to have some amount of training in being culturally responsive and understanding mental health. And then we've also are talking about what kinds of policy changes do we need to see so that we are thinking about girls' mental health from a systemic approach. And so a lot of that does impact schools where kids spend much of their lives, but also thinking about what are the ways that we have resources available in the community? What are the kinds of funding sources available? How are we ensuring that mental health providers are actually culturally competent, which some of them are not? So all of these, really thinking about these three prongs is what we're focusing on in the subgroup. One of the areas that we have gotten a chance to work on more is with a collaboration with Dr. Brian Sims and John Work. So I'm going to turn the table over to him.
Appreciate it, Brittany. Great intro. I know we're over budgeted time, so I'm going to try to be as quick as humanly possible. But yeah, excellent lead in. So Brian, I'm at JOMA Works. We do university K-12 partnership development. So super excited to talk about some of the work in culturally responsive school mental health training that we've been doing with BGEA. JOMA Works has partnered with folks all over the country. We've done millions of dollars worth of grants and evidence-based programs around a lot of things. I'm just really excited to collaborate and support BGEA's mission for Black girls. So the problem, right? 50%, we know from data, 50% of all mental health illness begins before age 14, and 75% of all mental illness occurs before the age of 24. At the same time, APA is telling us that 93% of teachers express major concerns over their students' mental well-being, but the vast majority of them feel almost totally ill-prepared to respond. So earlier in this call, Sharice at the very beginning mentioned the overwhelming need for culturally responsive mental health teacher support. And Tawanda mentioned the reality of mandated child abuse support training. Our data indicates that only about 20% of state standards across the country include competency in identifying early signs of mental health problems among students. So Jose, what you were saying about sex ed education, as a mandate, like same general problem here. Most teachers enter classrooms with no mental health training whatsoever. That's the status quo. And to Brittany's point, like what a wonderful / horrible time, right, to be talking about mental health for Black girls, because as we know, during the pandemic, Black and brown students experience disproportionately worse mental health outcomes, across the board, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, you name it. So our solution, and I think we can do the next slide here. So our solution is a model in which teachers and educators get a chance to interact with licensed mental health professionals. So there's evidence that mental health trainings for teachers can provide an important first step in addressing student mental health issues. Teachers who get training show way more outcomes, higher outcomes compared to those who don't in terms of relationships with students, classroom effectiveness, reducing peer victimization. And, as we all know, these are key factors that disproportionately and adversely affect Black girls. So the SMH training model is where participants meet virtually with one of our licensed mental health providers and other educators, fun, educating, engaging, safe, small group environment where they can learn and share strategies about promoting mental health in and out of the classroom. So JOMA Works sort of just provides the participants support each step of the way. We got pre-work to get them started, post-work once they're done with the training experience so that they can apply and share what they've learned. Participants can take an optional certification exam and even earn continuing education units. We're super excited about this partnership and collaboration with community organizations just like Wins Girls. Earlier in 2021, through a partnership, we piloted the program. The Health and Wellness Workgroup provided subject matter content for the training curriculum and secured local funding for trainings for 23 educators at 19 local service organizations. I've got a visual on the next slide, Brittany, so that I think it was on the next slide, I'm not sure. Just to give a visual of like some of the, I think we got a map of where some of, so all across Allegheny County. And, so what the goal is with this partnership is to take, locally grown, harnessed, community knowledge and wisdom and integrate that into the training approach and provide tangible, information into the SMH school kit, et cetera. So we were able to do that earlier this year. So 23 participants across 19 different organizations, mostly female. About 30% were classroom teachers, which means the majority weren't technically classroom teachers, but to some of the information you've heard before, that was kind of the goal. 100% of the participants found the training relevant to their current job and indicated that they would recommend this training to a colleague. So really excited about some of the early pilot data. Also, our illustrious leader, Dr. Kathy Elliott, is co-PI on a current Spencer Foundation grant proposal that's sponsored by the Johns Hopkins School of Education and the Bloomberg School of Public Health that will fund research into how to do that, how to integrate community knowledge like what we gather here across the BGEA into training programs like the one that we're cultivating. So obviously Black girls are a huge concern and part of this work, really interested in changing, again, to Brittany's point, the educational and policy climates around school mental health trainings for educators so that folks can be more positive around how to create and cultivate positive experiences, why we call it school mental health. And so thanks, just huge shout out. Thank you to you, Brittany and Jose and to Shira and everybody else across the health and wellness for all the love and support. One more quick thing, trainings are available and ongoing like right now, totally free for all BGEA affiliates. So if you're interested or know someone, Shira, absolutely. You guys can get, everyone here that's listening to this right now can get trained totally for free. Yes. So I'll put that information in the link, but obviously we want to get this information out to as many folks as possible to try to change that climate. So no, we're short on time. Thanks.
Thank you all. We really appreciate it. We knew as we were putting the agenda together that this would be a jam-packed all BGEA meeting. And so we appreciate you all for sharing all of those very important data and reports. And also I appreciate the fact that we ended on this positive note as far as what is an action step that we can take regarding mental health training in JOMA Works. And so thank you, Brian, for dropping the link and your email address into the chat. And so what we're going to do now, you all, is transition over into the breakout groups. Again, this is our chance to dive deeper into the potential policy priorities. Also, if there are additional data or questions that you all may have about any of the key issue areas, that's the time to have that conversation as well. I actually have here, give me just one second, a sheet for us to utilize to take notes. So work group conveners, I am going to ask that you please dedicate someone to take notes. And once I drop this link in the chat, we will also open up the work group. So I'm sorry, my internet is moving at Fred Flintstone speed today. Just one more second. Okay, and in the chat, Here we go with the note-taking page. And Kathy, did you want to add anything before I open the breakout groups?
No, I just hit clicking, so it's open. So people should be able to select one of 4 work groups that you want to participate in. Thank you all who have, Samantha said no break first. So I guess once you pick your room, take 5 minutes, go get water, go get refreshed, go, relieve yourselves, and then come back. And then we'll reconvene back as a whole. At what time, Tashara?
Let's come back at 2:45, please.
Tashara, do you know what time it is now, sweetheart? I love you dearly. You want to say 2:45? Oh, 2:45, everybody come back. Got you.
Yes.
After the break and the breakout. Okay. Whew, you had me a little. I thought that was like a secret you was telling me, and I missed it again.
We're doing everything in one, break and breakout group. So go ahead and transition to the breakout group so that when you come back from your break, you'll already be where you need to be. Thank you, Carol. Oh, welcome back. Hopefully that time spent didn't feel too rushed, but once again, these are conversations that we will be continuing to have into the new year. So thank you all for sticking around with us for this very important part of today's agenda. Let's shift over in the same order that we went for the presentation. So to the child welfare work group to answer just 1 or 2 of the questions that were listed on the notes document so that the whole group can hear some feedback about the dialogue that we had today. I think that would be Betsy.
Yes. All right. So we have decided we're going to continue working on the mandated reporter training, as well as possibly a checklist for people to stop and think before they make those referrals, not to stop people from making child lines, however, to really have the good documentation and make sure the reports are there. The other thing we talked a little bit about is the Family First legislation that's coming out that is going to influence how fundings and when money changes, policy and everything we do changes. So it really is to do more prevention and for the county to get paid for prevention services. However, there could be some potential implications of reducing our ability to choose the right service for families. The other piece that is really good is just really reducing congregate care of any kind. So there's parts of it that seem really good, but we want to really keep an eye on this implementation here in Allegheny County on that legislation.
Thank you, Betsy. And as she was speaking, I also dropped into the chat a link to the youth survey that Sharice and I mentioned earlier in the meeting, and we'll make sure you have that via email as well. But thank you, Betsy, for the child welfare report out and to know that the work is going to continue. One other thing I'll lift up too is that we were having conversations around Family First and this call for evidence-based programming and making sure that many of the orgs who are represented among the BGEA that might be smaller community-based organizations are not left out of that conversation because we know they do good work. Okay, so we'll turn it over next to education, and you all had the very large task of narrowing down the priorities. So let's start there for you all. Who is reporting out for education?
I can go ahead and, well, talk about what we did. I don't know that we narrowed down. I think what we more did was categorize.
Oh, I mean, you're fired. Everybody is fired. I'm just kidding.
So, I mean, we really were thinking that what our priorities are here were really harsh and exclusionary discipline. And so under that fell several of the items that were identified by the process. So the statewide suspension ban, police free schools, and increasing counselors and social workers, the dress code elimination, and the revising truancy policy, and then subjective infractions removing from the school code of conduct. So all of those kind of fall under that umbrella of unnecessary, exclusionary, and harsh discipline. So working on those with the lens really towards working with people, not just the policies, because we know when policies aren't enforced, they don't really benefit the students. So that's also was mentioned here too, kind of the lack of accountability. So doing some real support and cultivation work with staff around, child development and child thriving in that sense. And then also a separate priority area of parent engagement, which is always going to be very important in a place where I think a lot of Pittsburgh public schools and a lot of associated agencies are really struggling to bring in parents. So to use the resources of our group to engage parents in the most like healthy and productive way possible, to involve them in decisions from the beginning. And we also raised the issue of student mobility. So when students are moving from school to school, the developmental impacts of that, the need to reestablish peer relationships in a new school. So there's the two aspects of that, which would, I don't know if it falls under the education work group of reducing the causes of that student mobility and trying to keep students in consistent schools, even if they do move. And then also integrating new students when they come into a new school to ease those transitions and lessen the harm to students when they enter a new school building.
Thank you, Amanda. And did you all add any priorities or any other points to keep in mind?
The mobility one was an added.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we will now transition over to Juvenile Justice to answer for us one or two of the questions that you all were tasked with.
I don't know that we decided who would report back. Kim, are you want to? Or
Yeah,
Sam, you want to do it?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I offered to be the scribe, so then you by default, I guess you get to report. But some of our questions, were these priorities, did they feel right? And I think, yes, we want to continue to emphasize specifically the role that schools play in funneling kids to criminal justice and how to support both the adults in that scene and the kids who need help. And that really this is both a matter of like changing policy, implementing good policy and supporting kids where they need it, I think, in families. We changed we kind of weren't sure where the medical privacy for young people who were incarcerated got on our juvenile justice priorities because nobody could remember talking about that before. But so we changed that to support post-human planning, however we can, and kind of got on a conversation about both that diversion world and then also how to support young people who are deeply involved with juvenile justice and where we can be most helpful there. So that happened like 2 minutes before we came back. So lots more to talk about.
Thank you. And it looks like you may have added pay workers a living wage. Do you mean those folks who work in the juvenile justice system?
I don't know, Kim, can you take that? Because I was a bit distracted when we started.
Right, so current people that work with those youth that would come into placements and even at some agencies or service providers that work with kids, just that work with young people, paying them a higher meaningful wage.
Yeah,
I mean, just.
Thank you.
Target is killing us right now. Target is you can make $18 an hour. You can drive for Amazon right now for $24 an hour plus $3,000 signing bonus.
Plus McDonald's. So all those places, there's no reason to stay and get spit on. It's difficult.
Right. Exactly. That was was that how, part of being able to support young people is in all settings where adults are working with young people is for the adults to feel supported and valued and to keep them stable, right? Because otherwise there's turnover and people are having to work second or third jobs. So that was where that came from.
Absolutely.
Such a good point. Thank y'all. Okay, and we'll round it out with health and wellness.
All right, so we had some really great discussions. A couple of things we noted about the priorities. We want to make sure that we're explicitly addressing that sexual violence prevention needs to be named and is part of really truly holistic comprehensive sex ed, but we want to make sure that we're naming sexual violence prevention as a priority, which is a lot more of actually implementing existing policies, but that being really important. We also talked about, it's interesting following this conversation about paying people a living wage, but we talked about in terms of mental health, asking the question, like, are our educators, do they have access to mental health supports? And so if it's hard for them to be supporting the youth if they themselves aren't getting the support that they need. Really, really happy to hear from Sister I that PPS is partnering with ABPSI, which is the Association of Black Psychologists, who are training the mental health professionals who are within the school system right now. That is the gold standard. So that's really exciting news. And we're hoping to collaborate and sort of partner and continue to build on that work. And what else? Did I miss anything else, y'all? Cool.
And thank y'all also for teasing out the nuance around sexual violence. Thank you for that. And that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted to be able to take some of these issues from high level to actually understanding what it is we are trying to achieve in more specificity. So I want to thank you all for our all BGEA meeting and all the great participation today. Thank you to all of the work group conveners who have done a tremendous job this year in keeping this work moving forward. I remember when I first met Kathy, I asked, I said, how do all these people come to these meetings month after month? And she said, I don't know, but they are dedicated. And I've seen that magic firsthand. So we appreciate you all so much. As we begin to transition off, can you all please just share one word that you were taking with you into 2022? And y'all have an amazing holiday season. Got inspired, hopeful, empowered, hope, love. What are we taking with us until next year? Ooh, freedom.
Taking grateful. Thank you, everybody. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you and the work that you're doing. Thank you for being a part of this collaborative.
Thank you. Trying, urgency, clarity.
Changed.
Live, that's a great one. Persevere. We love you back, Sister I.